It's important to use a clear and logical structure for headings, but this can get a little bit confusing, so I do want to walk through what that means. So this first column here has an H1, H2, all the way down to an H6. You'll notice that the H1 is the biggest, and then it gets a little bit smaller as you get down to an H6. And that's because the H1 is the most important, and the H6 is the least important typically, so the size is representing that hierarchy as well. I also want to note that you do typically just want one H1 on a page, and that's more for SEO purposes to help Google search engines crawl your website and truly understand what that page is about. But it is unrealistic to expect that you'll have a page with one H1, one H2, one H3, all the way down to one H6. That's really not how content works. It's a little bit more fluid than that. So if we look at the second column here, we go 1, 2, 3, all the way to 4, and then we jump back to 2, and then we have 2 3s. This will also pass as well, because what you need to know about heading structure is once you have an H1, you go to an H2, you have to follow the order as you kind of cascade down. But then you can restart. So let's say I don't, H4, that's done with that section of content. I'm ready to move on to the next piece. I can jump to an H2, and then I kind of have to start cascading down again. So this right here will pass for accessibility. Where you don't pass for accessibility because you're not using a logical structure for your headings is this third column. So you see we have an H1 and then we jump to an H3 and we're skipping that H2 value, and that's what you can't do. And then we're resetting at an H2, but then we're jumping to an H5, skipping that H3 and that H4, and then H4 here skips that H5 and jumps to that H6. So as you go down, you can't skip values like that. You have to follow this order, and it's okay to have the same headings next to each other as well. And then this fourth column here, what I wanted to represent is, like I mentioned earlier, usually the H1s are the largest, and then it gets smaller and smaller as you get down to this H6. So sometimes what I've noticed when I look at people's content is that the H2 is too big for some spaces where you have those longer headings. So what people typically do is they just change it to an H3 or an H4 because those are typically smaller and will fill that space better. But that does break the structure for accessibility and even SEO. So instead what you want to do is leave it as an H2, but manually override the size to make it a little bit smaller. And that will keep your heading structure intact and then still look good within that space. I do want to note though, that if you are finding yourself making that H2 smaller a lot, then it's just time to reevaluate the sizing of your overall heading structure so you're not constantly manually overriding that, because you do want to try your best to keep this hierarchy of size in place as well for visual scanning purposes.